Hey everyone! Tonight, we begin with something so ordinary that it is probably difficult to imagine anyone starting a riot over it. Bread, not a crown, not a chest of silver, not a disputed castle standing above a misty valley. Just bread, warm when fortune is kind, hard when it is not, and present on so many tables that history books sometimes forget to mention it at all. Yet for centuries, bread has carried a strange political power. Kings have worried about it. Magistrates have regulated it. Merchants have hidden it. Crowds have fought over it. And sometimes, when the price of a loaf climbed just a little too high, governments discovered that hungry people could become remarkably interested in politics. So, if these quiet journeys into the forgotten corners of history help you relax, you can subscribe, leave a comment, or simply tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. Then dim the lights, settle somewhere comfortable, and let the room become quiet. Our story begins in England, in the year 1266. The morning arrives without ceremony. A pale light spreads across the roofs of a market town. Smoke slips from crooked chimneys. Somewhere behind a timber wall, a dog scratches itself awake. A cart creaks over damp earth, its wheels sinking into yesterday's mud. There is already the smell of wood smoke in the air, and underneath it, warmer and more comforting, there is bread. The baker has been awake for hours. His oven was heated while most of the town slept. Bundles of wood were pushed into the dark mouth of the oven until the stones became hot enough to bake the day's loaves. Flour hangs in the room like pale dust. It settles on the baker's sleeves, in his hair, and along the rough boards of his table. His work looks simple: flour, water, salt, yeast, or an older piece of fermented dough. But nothing about bread in medieval England is truly simple. Bread is too important. For a wealthy household, the finest bread might be made from carefully sifted wheat flour, pale and soft compared with the rough loaves eaten by laborers. For poorer families, the grain may be darker, coarser, and mixed according to what is available. Rye might find its way into the dough, barley might appear, oats might help stretch a household's grain supply. In difficult seasons, the distinction between bread and survival becomes very thin indeed. A modern visitor might look at the medieval table and notice what is missing. There are no potatoes from the Americas, no morning coffee, no chocolate tucked away for comfort. Many foods that later become ordinary parts of European life are still unknown here. But there is bread. Bread at breakfast. Bread with pottage. Bread beneath meat in wealthier homes. Bread carried into fields by laborers. Bread given as part of wages. Bread broken beside ale at the end of a cold day. For many people, grain provides an enormous share of the energy needed simply to remain alive and working. That gives the baker an unusual kind of power, and medieval authorities know it. In 1266, during the reign of King Henry III, English law gives formal force to rules concerning the price and weight of bread and ale. The regulations are remembered as the assize of bread and ale. The idea behind them is surprisingly familiar. When grain becomes expensive, a baker cannot simply make bread impossibly cheap. He still needs flour, he still needs fuel, he still needs to support his household and keep the oven burning. So the permitted weight of a loaf can change according to the price of grain. When grain is cheaper, the customer should receive a heavier loaf for the money. When grain becomes expensive, the loaf may become lighter. The price and the weight dance together. And watching this dance are local officials who know that a dishonest baker is not merely cheating a customer, he may be disturbing the peace. Imagine the market as morning gathers around it. Cloth awnings stretch above wooden stalls. Chickens complain from wicker cages. A woman examines onions with the grave attention of someone counting every coin she owns. Mud clings to boots. A butcher's block is already dark with work. Then there is the bread stall. People know roughly what they expect. They know how heavy a loaf should feel. They know what their neighbors have paid, and they know when something seems wrong. A loaf that is suspiciously small is not an abstract economic problem. It is tomorrow's hunger. Perhaps a laborer's wife picks one up and turns it in her hands. She has children at home. There is pottage in the pot, but pottage can be thin. Bread gives it substance. If the loaf is too light, someone may eat less. Usually, it will not be the person who performed the cheating. This is why the reputation of medieval bakers can become complicated. The baker is essential. He is also watched. People suspect that flour can be manipulated, weights can be false, and loaves can quietly shrink when nobody is paying attention. Some accusations are justified. Others probably grow from the ordinary mistrust that appears whenever one person controls something everyone else desperately needs. Officials therefore inspect bread. Loaves can be weighed, prices can be checked. Punishments may follow when standards are violated. Across medieval towns, dishonest trading can bring fines and public humiliation. The exact practices vary by place and period, but the message is clear enough. Food is not merely private business. The community has an interest in the loaf. That idea reaches far beyond one English market. Travel south toward London, and the same basic anxiety follows. Travel north toward York, and grain remains central to daily life. Cross the Channel toward Normandy or the busy towns of Flanders, and bread still sits close to the center of the ordinary person's world. Different grains dominate in different regions. Local customs change, laws change, ovens change, dependence does not. And dependence creates politics long before anyone uses the language of modern political economy. A king may claim authority through blood, a lord may claim land through inheritance, a bishop may speak of heaven. But the crowd in the marketplace has a simpler question. How much does the bread cost? It is a question that rulers ignore at their peril. The reason lies partly in the harvest. Medieval agriculture lives close to uncertainty. A season of heavy rain can damage grain. Cold weather can shorten growing periods. Plant disease, warfare, disrupted transport, or simple bad luck can reduce what reaches the market. There are no vast modern networks capable of moving enormous quantities of food quickly across continents. A shortage somewhere nearby matters. A bad harvest is visible. People see thin fields. They hear rumors from neighboring villages. They watch the grain market, then prices begin to rise. For the wealthy, higher grain prices are irritating. For the poor, they are frightening. A prosperous merchant may complain and continue eating. A laboring household has fewer choices. There are only so many coins. Rent still waits. Fuel is still needed. Clothing still wears thin. Children still wake hungry. So the loaf becomes a kind of measuring instrument. It measures the harvest. It measures wages. It measures the honesty of merchants. And, eventually, it measures the competence of rulers. This is one of the quiet truths of history. Political legitimacy often arrives at the dinner table before it appears in a parliament. A government may issue grand declarations. It may stamp seals into wax and send riders down muddy roads. It may display banners above stone gates. But if ordinary people believe that someone is hoarding grain while their children go hungry, the authority of those banners begins to feel less impressive. This does not mean every medieval shortage produces rebellion. Most do not. People endure astonishing hardship. Families borrow. Neighbors share. Households substitute cheaper grains. Meals become thinner. Belts are tightened in the most literal sense. Some people leave in search of work or food. Some simply become weaker. Yet beneath that endurance sits an expectation that appears again and again across European history. There should be limits. A merchant should not exploit famine without restraint. A baker should not sell an underweight loaf. A market should not become a playground for deception. And authorities should intervene when the basic order of survival is threatened. Centuries later, historians will describe versions of this expectation as a moral economy, an unwritten sense that food markets must obey not only profit, but fairness. The phrase belongs to a later age. The feeling is much older. Perhaps one of the baker's loaves is placed on a scale. The balance shifts. Someone watches. The loaf is a little too light. Nothing dramatic happens. No castle burns. No king loses his head. Perhaps there is only an argument beside a muddy market stall. Yet hidden inside that argument is a principle powerful enough to travel through centuries. People who depend on bread believe they have a right not merely to buy it, but to buy it fairly. And when that belief is violated often enough, the argument beside the stall can become something larger. The medieval baker does not know this. He is tired. His hands are covered in flour. The oven is hot, and there are more loaves to shape before the morning is gone. Outside, church bells move through the smoky air. Customers come and go. Coins change hands. Bread disappears into baskets and beneath woolen cloaks. The town continues with its day, but history has already placed something dangerous on the table. The idea that the price of bread is not only the baker's concern, it belongs to everyone. And once a society accepts that idea, a loaf can become more than food. It can become evidence, it can become accusation. And, in the right hungry hands, it can become a reason to rebel. The rebellion does not begin immediately. That is worth remembering. History often compresses hunger into a few dramatic sentences. A harvest fails. Prices rise. A crowd gathers. Windows break. Soldiers arrive. Someone writes down the names of the dead. But real hunger moves more slowly than that. It enters a household quietly. First, the bread becomes a little smaller, then the pottage becomes a little thinner. Then the good cheese is saved for Sunday. Then Sunday comes, and there is no good cheese. In the English countryside, generations pass beneath this quiet arithmetic. Wheat grows and is cut. Grain is carried to mills. Flour reaches ovens. Bread emerges warm into cold mornings, and the same old worries follow it from field to table. Who controls the grain? Who sets the price? Who eats first when there is not enough? By the early 14th century, these questions become painfully urgent. The weather turns against much of northern Europe. Beginning around 1315, relentless rain falls across wide regions. Fields become waterlogged. Grain struggles in the sodden earth. Hay cannot always be dried properly. Livestock suffers. Roads become difficult. The rain itself is not spectacular. There is no single thunderclap announcing disaster. It simply keeps coming. Rain on thatched roofs. Rain in village lanes. Rain over the fields around York. Rain across southern England and the Low Countries. Rain over parts of France. Rain soaking the roads toward Flanders. A farmer walks into his field and feels mud pulling at his shoes. The grain before him should be a promise. Instead, it looks weak. For a household living close to the edge, a poor harvest is never only a problem for the farmer. It moves outward. Less grain reaches market. The grain that does arrive costs more. Millers pay more. Bakers pay more. Customers stand before smaller loaves. The old relationship between grain price and bread weight becomes painfully visible. And now, the scale on the baker's table begins to resemble a clock counting down. The catastrophe that follows becomes known as the Great Famine. For several years, hunger spreads through much of northern Europe. It does not strike everyone equally. A noble household may still have stores, rents, animals, and access to distant markets. Monasteries may possess granaries and estates. Wealthy merchants can sometimes pay the higher prices. Poor laborers cannot. Their protection is their daily wage, and a daily wage becomes almost meaningless when the cost of food rises faster than earnings. Imagine a family in a small English town. There is no need to make them unusually poor. Ordinary poverty is enough. The father may work when work is available. The mother may brew, spin, mend, sell small goods, tend animals, or labor in ways that official records barely notice. Their children help as soon as their hands are useful. Most years, they manage. Not comfortably, but they manage. Then bread becomes expensive. At first, they buy less meat, then less ale. Then they burn less fuel. They gather what can be gathered. They stretch meals. They borrow. Perhaps a neighbor lends grain. Perhaps a relative has a little more. Perhaps the parish offers some form of assistance. But when an entire region suffers, the old networks of generosity begin to fail. The neighbor is hungry too. The relative has nothing to spare. The granary is not endless. Soon, hunger changes the way people look at the marketplace. A sack of grain is no longer merely merchandise. It is life being carried away. This is where the moral economy becomes dangerous. Suppose a merchant has grain stored in a warehouse. Perhaps he is waiting for a better price. From his point of view, this may be ordinary commerce. Grain is valuable. If supply is low, its price rises. Selling later could bring greater profit. But the hungry person outside does not see a clever business decision. He sees food hidden behind a door. He sees children with hollow faces. He sees a merchant waiting for desperation to become profitable. The difference between those two perspectives has started riots for centuries. In towns across medieval and early modern Europe, authorities repeatedly faced the same fear. Grain being hoarded, grain being exported, grain being bought cheaply and resold dearly. Sometimes the accusations are true, sometimes they are rumors. But rumors about food have unusual strength. A rumor does not need to be entirely accurate when the stomach is empty. Someone says carts of grain are leaving town. Someone else says a merchant has a secret store. Another person claims the baker is mixing bad flour into the dough. By afternoon, a crowd may believe that hunger has a human face. This matters because natural disaster is difficult to punish. You cannot drag the rain into the marketplace. You cannot fine a cold spring. You cannot put a failed harvest in the stocks. But you can confront a merchant, you can surround a mill, you can stop a grain cart. You can demand that bread be sold at what the crowd considers a fair price. And this is exactly what food protests often become. They are not always wild explosions of destruction. Many are strangely organized. Crowds sometimes seize grain and then insist on paying for it at a price they believe is just. That detail is important. The purpose is often not simple theft. It is correction. The crowd is saying that the market has broken its moral rules, and if officials will not repair it, ordinary people will. A sack is opened, grain is measured, coins are offered. The price is imposed by the people who need the food. To a merchant, this is terrifying. To a hungry household, it may feel like justice. Such confrontations reveal something that kings and ministers will spend centuries learning and relearning. People can tolerate inequality for a very long time. They can bow to lords, they can pay rents, they can watch carriages pass while walking barefoot through mud. They can accept that one table holds roasted meat while another holds onions and coarse bread. But there is a point at which inequality begins to look like deliberate starvation, and that point is politically explosive. The Great Famine of the early 14th century does not produce one clean revolution that can be marked neatly on a map. Its consequences are more scattered and more intimate. Bodies weaken, disease becomes more dangerous. Crime rises in some places. Communities strain. The confidence people place in rulers, landlords, and institutions can erode. The old promise of order feels less convincing when order cannot provide food. And there is another uncomfortable truth. Hunger changes memory. A child who spends a winter hungry may remember the price of bread long after forgetting the sermon preached on Sunday. A mother remembers which merchant refused to sell. A laborer remembers the official who protected a grain shipment from the crowd. A village remembers who opened a granary. These memories become stories. Stories become expectations. Expectations become political habits. So the history of bread is not only the history of famine, it is the history of what people believe society owes them when famine arrives. By later centuries, these beliefs become even more visible. In England, France, the German lands, and elsewhere, authorities attempt to control markets during moments of shortage. They regulate bakers, they inspect weights, they watch grain dealers. In London, officials know that a hungry city is an uneasy city. The same is true in York, the same is true across the Channel. A large town cannot feed itself from the gardens behind its houses. Grain must arrive from the countryside. It must move along roads and rivers. It must pass through the hands of farmers, merchants, millers, carriers, and bakers. Every step creates opportunity. Every opportunity creates suspicion. By dawn, a cart may be approaching a city gate. Its wheels creak beneath sacks of grain. A guard watches it pass. A merchant waits somewhere inside. A baker needs what the cart carries, and dozens of families who will never meet the farmer who grew the grain depend upon that cart arriving safely. This is one of the great transformations of urban life. The larger a city becomes, the more invisible its survival becomes. The person eating the bread does not see the field. The person growing the wheat does not see the child eating the loaf. Between them stands a chain of strangers. When the chain works, nobody thinks much about it. When it breaks, everyone suddenly notices. Bread, therefore, becomes a kind of daily referendum on the functioning of society. A loaf on the table means the harvest worked, transport worked, milling worked, baking worked, trade worked, and somehow the household could afford the final price. An empty table means something failed. The argument begins over what? Was it weather, war, greed, bad government, hoarding, taxes, merchants, foreigners, landowners? The answers change from century to century, the anger does not. And gradually, European rulers begin to understand that keeping bread available is not an act of kindness. It is an act of self-preservation. A monarch may have soldiers, but soldiers need bread too. A city may have walls, but walls cannot silence thousands of empty stomachs. A magistrate may read laws aloud in the marketplace, but if the baker's shelves are empty, the crowd may listen differently. The relationship between food and authority grows particularly sharp as Europe moves toward the early modern age. Markets expand, cities grow, commercial networks become more complex. Grain travels farther, more people depend upon prices they cannot control. And when prices rise, the old expectation remains. Food should be fair. This expectation is not written neatly in a constitution. It lives in custom. It lives in memory. It lives in the angry murmur outside the bakery before sunrise. There is something almost intimate about that murmur. The people waiting are not yet revolutionaries. They are servants, laborers, washerwomen, porters, apprentices, widows, children sent by tired parents with a few coins folded into a hand. They want breakfast. That is all. But history has a habit of placing enormous political questions inside very ordinary needs. Who deserves to eat? Who decides the price? How much profit is acceptable when others are starving? What does a ruler owe the ruled? At what point does obedience end? Those questions are already present in the medieval marketplace, hidden beneath the smell of yeast and wood smoke. They wait, centuries pass, kings die, dynasties change, ships cross seas, wars redraw borders, the ovens remain hot. And then, in the 18th century, the old problem returns with a new intensity. Let us leave the soot-stained English oven behind and cross the Channel, where the roads are wider, the markets louder, and rumours are beginning to move faster than grain. It is spring in France. The year is 1775. Paris is not yet the city of revolution that later generations will remember. The Bastille still stands. Louis XVI is a young king. Marie Antoinette is a young queen. Versailles glitters beneath chandeliers and mirrors. And the guillotine has not yet become the dark symbol of an age. For now, the danger is much simpler. Bread is becoming expensive. The problem begins partly with reform. The French government has long interfered heavily in the grain trade. Officials understand the ancient danger of food shortages, but regulation can also create inefficiency, corruption, and distorted markets. A reforming minister named Anne Robert Jacques Turgot believes that grain should move more freely. He is intelligent, serious, and convinced that freer trade can improve the supply of food. In theory, grain will travel toward places where it is most needed. Competition will encourage production. Old restrictions will loosen. The market will breathe. It sounds reasonable in a minister's office. Then the harvest is poor, prices rise. And hungry people begin to hear that the government has deliberately allowed merchants to charge more for grain. Economic theory meets the bakery queue. The bakery queue is not impressed. Across parts of France, anxiety spreads. People suspect speculators. They suspect merchants. They suspect officials. Some believe powerful men are intentionally creating scarcity to enrich themselves. The idea of a famine plot has deep roots in French popular fear. The belief that hunger is not merely happening, but being arranged. Again, the distinction between truth and rumor becomes less important than the conditions that make the rumor believable. A family does not need a lecture on grain markets. It sees the loaf. Yesterday the loaf cost less. Today it costs more. Wages have not risen. Something must be wrong. Crowds begin gathering. They stop grain shipments. They enter markets. They force merchants to sell at prices the crowd considers fair. The pattern is ancient. But the scale is becoming larger. In some places, people seize flour. In others, they confront bakers. The disturbances spread across northern and central France and approach the region around Paris. Later, these events will be called the Flour War. The name sounds almost quaint, a war of flour, something soft and white drifting through the air. But there is nothing quaint about a parent calculating whether a day's wages can still buy enough bread. And there is nothing trivial about thousands of people discovering, almost at once, that the government and the governed have very different ideas about what a fair food market should look like. The medieval loaf has traveled a long way. It has moved from the baker's scale to the center of a political argument. Soon that argument will spill onto the roads of France. And the people standing there will teach the monarchy a lesson it does not fully understand until it is far too late. Bread may be ordinary. Hunger never is. The trouble begins, as trouble often does, with a rumor. Somewhere along a road outside Paris, a cart loaded with grain creaks toward a market. The horses are tired. Their harnesses are dark with sweat. Dust gathers on the driver's coat. To the merchant who owns the grain, the sacks are goods. To the people watching from the roadside, they are meals. That difference is enough to make the road feel dangerous. By the spring of 1775, France is uneasy. The previous harvest has disappointed many regions, and the price of grain has risen. Because bread consumes so much of an ordinary family's income, even a modest increase can feel enormous. A wealthy gentleman may notice the change only when his steward presents the household accounts. A laborer notices it before breakfast. In villages north of Paris, women enter bakeries carrying a few coins and leave with less bread than they expected. Men returning from work hear complaints at home. Children are told to wait until evening. The loaf has not vanished. That almost makes the situation worse. It is there. People can see it, they simply cannot always afford enough of it. Then come the stories. A merchant is hiding grain, a miller has locked flour away. A convoy is taking wheat somewhere else because a better price can be found there. Officials are protecting speculators. The king's ministers are experimenting with the food of the poor. Somewhere, someone is getting rich. None of these stories needs to be entirely true. They need only to sound possible. And in a society where grain merchants really do buy, store, transport, and resell food for profit, suspicion comes easily. The recent reforms make that suspicion sharper. Turgot has attempted to free the internal grain trade from older restrictions. His purpose is not to starve anyone. He believes freer movement will encourage grain to reach places where demand is strongest and eventually encourage greater production. It is a vision built upon patience. Hungry people have very little patience. The reform also violates an older expectation. For generations, many French people have believed that the king has a paternal duty toward his subjects. He is not expected to bake every loaf himself, of course, but food, especially bread, belongs to a special category. Bread should be watched. Bread should be protected. Bread should remain within reach. If merchants appear to control it completely, something feels morally wrong. The king is supposed to stand above private greed. So when prices rise after the reforms, the public does not necessarily conclude that weather, supply, transportation, and market adjustment have combined in unfortunate ways. Some conclude that the king has abandoned them. Others imagine something darker. They whisper about a pacte de famine, a supposed famine plot. Perhaps powerful men are deliberately driving up grain prices. Perhaps they intend to profit from hunger. Perhaps scarcity itself has been manufactured. The rumors move through marketplaces faster than officials can answer them, and then, in late April, unrest begins to take physical form. At Beaumont-sur-Oise, north of Paris, a crowd gathers around the grain market. The scene does not begin like a grand revolution. There are no elegant speeches about the rights of man. No one carries a constitution. There are hungry people looking at grain. Voices rise, the price is too high. The crowd demands that it be lowered. When sellers resist, the people impose a price themselves. This practice has a strange order to it. Grain may be taken from merchants, but it is not always simply stolen. The crowd may insist upon paying what it considers the proper amount. Imagine the confusion. A merchant protests that the grain belongs to him. Someone in the crowd answers that he is being paid. The merchant says the price is too low. The crowd says his price is too high. Each side believes the other is committing an injustice. Coins are counted, sacks are opened, measures are filled, flour dust settles on sleeves. The market has become a courtroom without a judge, and the crowd has decided to deliver the verdict. News travels. One village hears what another village has done. People discover that they are not alone. This is one of the quiet engines of rebellion. A grievance can remain private for years. A person thinks, perhaps, that hardship is simply his own misfortune. Then he learns that the next village is angry too. Suddenly, hardship has company. Company gives it courage. The disturbances spread through the region around Paris. Crowds stop grain carts, they enter markets, they visit mills, they demand lower prices. At some places, storehouses are forced open. At others, merchants are compelled to sell. The goal is remarkably consistent. The people are not trying to abolish bread markets, they are trying to make the market behave according to what they believe is fair. To modern ears, there is something unusual about a riot in which participants sometimes pay for the goods they seize, but this is precisely what reveals the deeper logic. The crowd does not necessarily see itself as criminal. It sees itself as enforcing justice. The authorities see things differently. From Versailles, the disturbances are alarming. A government cannot easily accept the principle that a crowd may decide prices whenever it dislikes the market. If that principle spreads from grain to other goods, authority itself begins to dissolve. And so the monarchy faces an old dilemma. If it protects the merchants, it appears to side with profit against hunger. If it accepts the crowd's demands, it teaches the crowd that disorder works. Neither choice is comfortable. Soldiers are sent, officials issue orders. The state begins restoring control, yet force has limits. A soldier can clear a market square. He cannot make bread cheaper. He can escort a grain convoy. He cannot make the harvest larger. He can arrest a protester. He cannot arrest hunger. This is why food unrest is so difficult for governments. The immediate disorder may be suppressed, while the cause remains sitting quietly at the family table. In Paris, the atmosphere grows tense. The capital is a vast consumer of grain. It depends upon complicated supply routes stretching into the countryside. Every baker's oven is connected, invisibly, to fields far beyond the city walls. Parisians know this dependence. They also know how quickly things can go wrong. A bakery without bread attracts attention. A grain cart moving under guard attracts more. People watch, they talk, they calculate. For a poor household, bread can consume much of what the family earns. When its price rises, there is little room to adjust. The wealthy can substitute. The poor mostly subtract. Less food, less fuel, less comfort, less certainty. Perhaps a woman wakes before dawn and joins a bakery line. The street is still dark. The stones beneath her shoes are cold. Someone ahead of her has wrapped a shawl tightly around her shoulders. There is quiet conversation. How much yesterday? How much today? Did you hear about the grain at Pontoise? Did you hear what happened on the road? Did you hear they are hiding flour? The bakery door remains closed. A light appears inside. People move closer. This is how political consciousness can form without anyone intending it. Not in a palace, not in a university. Not even in a tavern, in a queue. One person brings a rumor, another brings a complaint, a third remembers what bread used to cost. By the time the door opens, strangers have discovered a shared enemy. Perhaps the enemy is real, perhaps imagined. Usually, it is a mixture of both. The flour war reaches toward Versailles itself. That fact matters. Versailles is not merely another French town. It is the physical theatre of monarchy. Its halls are polished. Its gardens are disciplined into elegant geometry. Water rises from fountains according to royal design. Courtiers move through rooms beneath painted ceilings. Everything seems controlled. Outside those carefully arranged spaces, grain prices refuse to obey royal choreography. Crowds move toward places associated with power. The contrast is almost too perfect. Inside the palace, etiquette decides who may approach the king. Outside, hunger has its own etiquette. It approaches without permission. The government eventually suppresses the disturbances. Troops restore order. Arrests are made. The monarchy demonstrates that it still possesses force. Turgot's experiment with the grain trade survives the immediate crisis only briefly as part of his wider program of reform. His political position weakens, and he leaves office the following year. The Flower War ends. France does not become a republic. The Bastille does not fall. Louis XVI remains king. Paris returns to its ordinary noises. Bakers wake before dawn. Flour is needed. Ovens glow. Loaves are carried into the streets. It might appear that nothing fundamental has changed, but something has. The disturbances have revealed how fragile the relationship between monarchy and food has become. The people have shown that they possess their own idea of economic justice. The government has shown that it may defend market principles even when crowds believe those principles threaten survival. And perhaps most importantly, a generation has learned that bread prices can bring thousands of ordinary people into collective action. 14 years later, that lesson will matter. The people who lived through the Flower War do not know what is waiting for them. They cannot see the Bastille in ruins. They cannot see the royal family forced from Versailles. They cannot see the execution of a king. History has not yet given them those images. For now, there is only a loaf on a wooden counter. But the monarchy has been warned. Bread is no longer simply a food that must be supplied. It is becoming a measure of trust. When the loaf is affordable, the kingdom feels a little more stable. When it is not, every explanation from Versailles sounds weaker. And this weakness grows during the years that follow. France is a wealthy kingdom in many ways, but its finances are deeply troubled. War has been expensive. Taxation is unequal and inefficient. Privilege protects many powerful interests. Reform is necessary. Reform is also extraordinarily difficult. Meanwhile, ordinary life continues beneath the great political problems. A peasant still worries about the harvest. A laborer still worries about wages. A mother still worries about tomorrow's bread. These concerns may appear smaller than state debt or diplomatic rivalry. They are not. For most people, the kingdom is experienced through ordinary things: the tax collector, the landlord, the price at the market, the weight of the loaf. This is why revolutions can surprise those who live near the top of society. From above, everything may look manageable. Documents move through offices. Ministers debate. Officials report that order has returned. From below, resentment accumulates in places that rarely appear in official papers. At the mill, at the market, outside the bakery, beside the kitchen fire, a loaf is cut into smaller pieces. Someone notices, someone remembers, and memory waits. By the late 1780s, the waiting is almost over. Another series of poor harvests will place enormous pressure upon the French food supply. The price of bread will rise again. But this time, hunger will meet something larger than a dispute over grain policy. It will meet a monarchy in financial crisis, a public increasingly willing to criticize authority, a political system struggling to reform itself, pamphlets moving through cities, rumors moving through markets, and millions of people who have inherited an old belief that the ruler has a duty to keep bread within reach. The next crisis will not be remembered as a flour war. It will acquire a much larger name: the French Revolution. And yet, when that great event begins to move, its footsteps will still pass the bakery door. We drift onward, deeper into the uneasy streets of France, leaving the grain carts of 1775 behind. 14 years pass. The spring rains return. The fields change color. Children become adults. Louis XVI grows older upon his throne, and in Paris before sunrise, people once again begin lining up for bread. This time, the kingdom itself is standing in the queue. Paris wakes hungry. It is the summer of 1789, and before the sun reaches the upper windows of the city, people are already standing outside bakeries. They wait in narrow streets where yesterday's mud has dried into the cracks between stones. Chimneys breathe smoke into the pale morning. Somewhere a cart rattles over the road, and heads turn at the sound. Perhaps it carries flour. People have learned to notice such things. The Kingdom of France is now in a crisis far greater than the one it faced during the Flower War. The royal treasury is in terrible condition. Years of war and borrowing have left the monarchy deeply in debt. Attempts at reform have repeatedly collided with privilege and resistance, yet for the woman standing outside the bakery, national debt is distant, bread is not. She knows the weight of the coins in her hand. She knows what her household earns, and she knows that the loaf has become painfully expensive. For ordinary working families, bread can consume an enormous portion of household income in difficult times. When grain prices rise sharply, there is little left for anything else. The mathematics of poverty is cruel because it is so simple. Bread first, then rent, then fuel, if possible. Everything else waits. The crisis has been growing for months. The harvest of 1788 is poor. Severe weather adds to the difficulty. Grain becomes scarce in many places, and prices climb. Then winter arrives with unusual severity. Rivers freeze, roads become difficult, mills and transport networks suffer disruption. The cold enters houses that already have too little fuel. By spring, France is not merely politically troubled, it is tired, hungry, suspicious, and increasingly willing to blame someone. At Versailles, the monarchy has summoned the Estates General, an assembly representing the traditional orders of French society. It has not met for generations. The decision is extraordinary. Across France, people prepare lists of grievances. They complain about taxation, feudal burdens, privilege, corruption, justice, representation, and the price of necessities. The language of politics is spreading. But politics does not replace hunger, it joins it. A man who once complained only about bread may now complain about taxes. A woman who has spent hours in a bakery queue may hear that nobles possess privileges ordinary people do not. An artisan whose wages no longer cover food may begin wondering why the kingdom is organized as it is. These grievances begin to touch one another. That is when a crisis becomes dangerous. A hungry crowd is frightening. A hungry crowd with a political vocabulary is something else entirely. In Paris, rumors move constantly. There will be no bread tomorrow. Grain is being hidden. Aristocrats are plotting against the people. Troops are gathering. The king will dissolve the new assembly. Foreign soldiers will enter the city. Someone has seen wagons. Someone knows a servant at Versailles. Someone's cousin heard something at a market. Truth travels through the city, so does invention. They often walk together by July. The atmosphere is thick with fear. The dismissal of Jacques Necker, a royal minister widely regarded by many Parisians as sympathetic to reform, intensifies the crisis. Crowds gather, weapons are sought. On the 14th of July, Parisians move toward the Bastille. The fortress is not a bakery. Its capture is not simply a bread riot. It represents royal authority, military power, and the fear that force may be used against the population. But hunger walks beside politics that day. The men and women in the streets have not forgotten the bakery lines. They have not forgotten rising prices. They have not forgotten the fear that food may disappear. When the Bastille falls, Europe receives an image that will echo for centuries, a fortress overcome by ordinary people. Yet afterward, the ordinary problem remains. People still need to eat. Revolutions do not suspend breakfast. The destruction of a symbol does not fill an oven. This is one of the quieter realities hidden behind dramatic history. A crowd may overthrow an institution in the afternoon and still worry about supper in the evening. Paris continues to struggle with food supply, bread remains expensive, rumors of hoarding and conspiracy remain powerful, and the monarchy remains associated with a question it cannot escape. Why are the people hungry? At Versailles, court life continues, though the world around it is changing rapidly. The palace has long been designed to impress. Its vast rooms, mirrors, gardens, fountains, paintings, and ceremonies turn monarchy into theatre. Visitors understand immediately that the king stands at the center of an elaborate political universe. But grandeur becomes dangerous when viewed through an empty stomach. A gilded room looks different when bread is affordable. When bread is scarce, gold begins to resemble accusation. This helps explain the enduring power of stories about royal extravagance. The most famous is the claim that Marie Antoinette responded to reports that the people lacked bread by suggesting they eat cake. There is no reliable evidence that she said it. Versions of the story existed before it became attached to her, but the fact that so many people later believed the tale tells us something important. The story felt true, not factually true, emotionally true. It captured the image many people had formed of a distant court that could not understand ordinary hunger. Marie Antoinette becomes a symbol onto which resentment is poured, her clothing, her spending, her entertainments, her foreign birth. Everything can be made part of the story, and bread sits quietly at its center. The Queen does not need to have spoken the famous words. The political damage comes from living in a society where people can imagine that she might have, by autumn, the tension becomes unbearable. The harvest has come, but food problems remain. Prices and supply continue to trouble Paris. Then, in early October, women begin gathering in the city. Rain falls. The morning is cold and wet. The first crowds form around marketplaces. Many of the participants are working women who understand food prices with an intimacy few ministers possess. They buy provisions. They feed households. They stand in lines. They hear complaints from bakers. They know when a loaf has become smaller. For them, bread is not an economic statistic. It has weight, smell, texture, price. They know how many mouths must divide it, and they are angry. The crowd grows. Women call others into the streets. Men join them. Weapons appear. Drums sound. Someone speaks of Versailles. The king is there. So is the National Assembly. So, perhaps, is the answer to the bread crisis. The distance from Paris to Versailles is not enormous, but on foot, in autumn rain, it is far enough. Still they go. Thousands move along the road. Their skirts and coats become soaked. Shoes sink into mud. Some carry pikes. Some carry muskets. Some carry whatever can serve as a weapon. Others carry little more than determination. The march is noisy, yet imagine for a moment the quieter sounds within it. Wet footsteps, heavy breathing, the creak of carts. Rain against cloth, a woman coughing, another complaining about the cold, someone laughing despite everything. Someone asking how much farther. Revolutions are made by bodies, and bodies become tired, they become hungry, they get blisters, they need rest. The marchers continue. Behind the great political symbolism is an ordinary demand. Bread. At Versailles, their arrival transforms the atmosphere. The palace that has long drawn nobles seeking royal favor now receives visitors of another kind. Wet, exhausted, angry people from Paris. They do not arrive according to court etiquette. Hunger has never been especially respectful of etiquette. Delegations demand action. The king is pressed to respond to the food crisis and to political developments that have unfolded since summer. The National Assembly is drawn into the confrontation. Hours pass. Night settles over Versailles. Some of the marchers sleep where they can. Others remain awake. The rain and mud cling to clothing. The palace glows nearby. It must have seemed an extraordinary contrast. Outside, ordinary people wrapped in wet fabric. Inside, mirrors and chandeliers. The old France and the new one have come physically close enough to hear each other breathing. Then morning brings violence. Some members of the crowd enter the palace. Royal guards are attacked. Panic moves through the corridors. Marie Antoinette is forced to flee from her rooms. For a moment, the monarchy itself seems frighteningly vulnerable. Eventually, the king agrees to leave Versailles for Paris. The royal family prepares to depart. And now the march changes direction. The road that carried the hungry crowd toward the palace carries the monarchy back toward the capital. The procession is strange, enormous, almost dreamlike. People surround the royal carriage. Grain and flour accompany the return. The crowd celebrates. Songs and shouts rise through the damp air. The King of France is no longer comfortably distant at Versailles. He is being brought to Paris. The political center of gravity has shifted, and bread has helped move it. There is a cruel simplicity to the moment. For centuries, monarchy has projected power outward from palaces. Now hungry citizens have gone to the palace and physically pulled monarchy closer to them. They want the king where they can see him, where he can see them, where the shortage of bread cannot remain an abstract report on a minister's desk. The royal family takes up residence in the Tuileries Palace. Versailles will never again serve Louis XVI as it once did. The revolution continues. Its causes are far larger than bread. There is state debt. There is social inequality. There are disputes over representation. There is Enlightenment political thought. There are conflicts over taxation, privilege, sovereignty, and the structure of the old regime. No serious history of the French Revolution can reduce all of this to a bakery queue, but neither can bread be removed from the story. Hunger gives political grievances urgency. High prices give abstract inequality a daily shape. A person may not understand the royal budget. She understands that she worked all day and still cannot buy enough food. A laborer may never read a philosophical treatise. He understands that privilege protects some people while his children eat less. Bread translates structural crisis into something the body can understand. An empty stomach does not require literacy. That may be bread's strange political power. It turns distant systems into immediate sensations. Tax policy becomes a smaller loaf, bad weather becomes a longer queue, weak administration becomes an empty shelf. Economic inequality becomes the smell of bread someone else can afford. And when enough people experience those sensations together, they begin to recognize one another. The queue becomes a crowd. The crowd becomes a march. The march reaches a palace, and a king begins the journey back to Paris. As evening settles over the road from Versailles, wheels roll through the mud. The royal carriage moves slowly. Around it walk the people who have forced history to change direction. Some are triumphant, some are exhausted. Many are still thinking about food. Tomorrow there will be another morning, another oven to heat, another line to join, another loaf to divide. The revolution has entered a new stage, but hunger has not vanished. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the story. Bread does not start revolutions because it is extraordinary. Bread starts revolutions because it is ordinary. People can live without palaces. They can live without court ceremonies. They can live without silk gowns, fountains, jeweled buckles, and painted ceilings. They cannot live without food. When a government appears unable to understand that distinction, even the quietest bakery can become a political place. And in France, the smell of warm bread will now mingle with gunpowder for years to come. The king is in Paris now. That should solve something at least. This is what many people hope. The royal family is closer. The National Assembly is reshaping the country. Old privileges are being challenged. Feudal rights are being dismantled. Words that once belonged mainly to philosophers and lawyers are now spoken in workshops, taverns, markets, and crowded streets. Liberty, nation, citizen, rights. Yet every morning bakers still wake before dawn. They still need dough. They still worry about flour. And ordinary families still count coins. The revolution has changed the language of France more quickly than it can change the harvest. This creates a strange contrast. A man may now call himself a citizen rather than merely a subject, but citizenship does not make his supper larger. A woman may hear that equality has become a national principle, then stand in a queue where there is not enough bread for everyone. The old regime is collapsing. The stomach remains stubbornly old-fashioned. It wants food. Nothing about political philosophy can persuade it to wait. Through the revolutionary years, food remains one of the pressures shaping events. The problem is not constant famine everywhere. Conditions vary from place to place and season to season. Harvests improve and worsen, prices rise and fall, but fear remains. Fear has memory. Once people have stood in a bakery queue wondering whether the bread will run out before they reach the door, they do not easily forget. A rumor of scarcity can bring the old anxiety back at once. Paris is particularly vulnerable. It is a large city dependent upon food arriving from beyond its streets. Grain must travel inward continually. A delay matters, a shortage matters. A rumor matters, and revolution makes everything more uncertain. Officials change, laws change, administrative systems are reorganized. Political factions struggle for power. Foreign monarchies watch France with growing concern. Emigration removes some members of the old elite. Religious conflict deepens. Then war comes. War has always had an appetite. Armies need grain, horses need fodder, soldiers need shoes, uniforms, weapons, and wages. Transport is diverted, roads become military arteries, money becomes strained. and ordinary civilians once again find themselves competing with forces much larger than their households. By 1792, France is at war with European powers. The revolution becomes more radical. The monarchy falls. Louis XVI is imprisoned. France becomes a republic. The man who once occupied the great rooms of Versailles is now a prisoner of the revolution. The transformation is astonishing. Only a few years earlier, crowds had marched to his palace demanding bread and political action. Now the crown itself is disappearing. In January of 1793, Louis is executed. Marie Antoinette follows later that year. The royal family that had been brought from Versailles to Paris in a procession surrounded by demands for bread has been destroyed. But the death of a king does not solve the grain market. If anything, conditions become more difficult. War expands. Civil conflict tears through parts of France. Inflation damages the value of money. The revolutionary government issues paper currency known as assignats, and over time their value falls badly. For ordinary people, this creates another cruel transformation. A price written on a loaf may rise not only because grain is scarce, but because the money used to purchase it is losing value. The worker is trapped between wages and prices again, always again. The names of institutions change, the coins and notes change, the people in government change, but the household calculation remains familiar. How much bread can today's work buy? In Paris, popular political activists demand stronger action. They are often called sans-culottes, a term associated with ordinary working people who do not wear the fashionable knee breeches of the wealthy. Among them are artisans, shopkeepers, wage earners, and others who believe the revolution must do more than declare legal equality. Freedom means little if speculation allows the poor to starve. This idea sounds remarkably similar to the older moral economy of the medieval marketplace. The language has changed, the expectation has not. Centuries earlier, a crowd might surround a grain merchant and demand a fair price. Now, revolutionary citizens demand that the republic itself enforce fairness. They call for controls, they attack hoarding, they denounce speculators, they insist that necessities cannot be treated like luxury goods. Bread has followed Europe from monarchy into revolution without losing its political power. Eventually, the revolutionary government adopts price controls. The general maximum attempts to limit prices and wages. Grain and other essential goods are brought under regulation. The government is trying to accomplish something rulers have attempted in different forms for centuries. Make food affordable, keep markets functioning, prevent hoarding, avoid riots, feed cities, feed armies, and somehow persuade producers and merchants to continue supplying goods when prices are controlled. There is no easy answer. Price controls may make bread officially cheaper. They can also create problems if farmers or merchants decide that selling at controlled prices is not worthwhile. Enforcement becomes necessary. Officials search for hoarded goods. Local authorities struggle with supply. The revolutionary state reaches deeper into economic life. Once again, bread has turned into administration. Forms, inspections, orders, penalties, lists. Behind every grand revolutionary speech, somewhere there is a clerk trying to count sacks of flour. It is an oddly comforting image. History may appear to be made entirely of dramatic men standing before assemblies. In reality, someone always has to count the sacks. The revolution becomes increasingly violent. Enemies are seen everywhere. Foreign armies threaten France. Internal rebellions erupt. Political factions destroy one another. The Committee of Public Safety rises to extraordinary power. The reign of terror begins. Executions become a grim part of political life. The guillotine, once presented as a more equal and efficient method of execution, becomes the most famous symbol of the period. Crowds gather to watch. Carts carry condemned prisoners through streets where bread is still bought and sold. This is one of history's strange juxtapositions. A baker opens his shop in the morning. A prisoner passes toward execution. Someone buys onions. A political speech is printed. A child chases a dog. A church bell sounds. A government falls. Ordinary life does not wait politely for extraordinary events to finish. It lives among them. For the poor, survival remains its own daily revolution. Find bread, Find fuel, keep working, avoid trouble, listen to rumors, hope tomorrow is cheaper. Perhaps this is why food can become so politically powerful. It refuses to remain symbolic. A flag can be folded away. A speech can end. A pamphlet can be placed on a shelf. Hunger returns every few hours. The revolution eventually consumes many of its own leaders. Robespierre, one of the central figures of the Terror, falls and is executed in the summer of 1794. The political climate changes again, the terror recedes. A new government emerges, but economic instability continues. Price controls are relaxed and then abandoned. Inflation worsens. The assignat collapses, and once more the poor face rising food prices. The irony is bitter. The revolution has proclaimed equality. It has executed a king. It has redrawn institutions. It has rewritten laws. It has challenged the church. It has mobilized armies on an enormous scale. And still Paris can wake hungry. In the spring of 1795, popular unrest returns. Crowds demand bread. They also invoke the democratic constitution that had been approved but never fully put into effect. Here, bread and political rights stand beside one another almost perfectly. The demand is not merely food, it is bread and constitutional government. The body and the citizens speak together. For authorities, the message is alarming. The revolution was supposed to create a new political order. Instead, the old food question keeps returning through the door. Bread, bread, bread. Again and again, the crowds are suppressed. The radical popular movement of Paris loses much of its power. Political control shifts. Eventually, another figure rises through the instability, Napoleon Bonaparte. His story will become one of armies, empire, law, ambition, and war across Europe. Yet even Napoleon understands a basic truth that medieval kings knew before him. Armies march on food. Cities remain peaceful when food arrives. A government that cannot feed its people is always standing on uncertain ground. This truth is older than France, older than revolution, older than Versailles. It belongs to the first moment when a human community stored grain and someone asked who controlled the storehouse. The French Revolution gives the question spectacular form, but it does not invent it. Bread does not single-handedly cause the revolution. That would make history far too simple. France does not overthrow its monarchy because one loaf becomes expensive. The revolution emerges from a dense knot of financial crisis, social hierarchy, political conflict, Enlightenment ideas, institutional weakness, taxation, war, public opinion, and economic distress. Bread connects many of these forces to daily life. That is its role. It makes the crisis tangible. Consider again the woman outside the bakery. Perhaps she cannot read, perhaps she can. Perhaps she knows little about the philosophical writings discussed by educated men. Perhaps she knows quite a lot, it hardly matters. She understands a political fact that requires no book. Yesterday, her wages bought enough bread. Today, they do not. Someone must explain why. And if the explanation sounds like indifference, incompetence, or greed, she may stop believing that the existing order deserves obedience. That is the moment rulers should fear, not merely when people become hungry. People have endured hunger for thousands of years. The dangerous moment comes when hunger requires an explanation. Someone is responsible, someone is profiting, someone is failing, someone has broken the rules. Once hunger has a villain, it becomes political. Once political hunger finds a crowd, it becomes power. France learns this through rain-soaked marches, market disturbances, bakery queues, legislation, executions, and years of instability, but France is not unique. Across the Channel, Britain is watching. There too, bread sits at the center of ordinary life. There too, landowners have political power. There too, workers know exactly how much food their wages can buy. And after the great wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France finally come to an end, Britain will make a decision about grain. The decision will protect agricultural interests. It will also make bread a symbol of privilege. Let us cross the cold Channel now, leaving the restless streets of Paris behind. The guns of the Napoleonic Wars are falling silent. Soldiers are coming home. Factories are growing. Smoke hangs over new industrial towns. In London, Parliament turns its attention toward imported grain. British landowners are worried. During the long wars, grain prices have often been high. Domestic farming has expanded under the protection created by conflict and disrupted trade. Peace threatens to change that. Foreign grain may enter Britain more cheaply, consumers might welcome cheaper food, landowners see something else. Falling rents, falling agricultural prices, falling profits. So Parliament acts. In 1815, the year of Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, Britain passes a new corn law restricting the importation of foreign grain until domestic prices reach a high level. To those who benefit, it is protection. To those buying bread, it can look very different. The word corn in this setting does not mean only the yellow maize that a modern listener might picture. In British usage of the period, it refers broadly to cereal grains, especially wheat, and wheat means bread. So the law is not an obscure regulation concerning distant merchants. It reaches directly toward the breakfast table. A factory worker in Manchester may never meet the landowner whose interests Parliament protects. A labourer in London may never read the full legislation. A family in Edinburgh may know little of the arguments made in Westminster. But all of them understand the price of bread. That is the peculiar power of food policy. It travels downward. A speech becomes a law. A law affects imports. Imports affect grain supply. Grain affects flour. Flour affects bread. And eventually, a political decision made beneath the grand ceilings of Parliament appears as a smaller meal in a working family's room. The British government has not intended to begin a revolution, quite the opposite. Britain's ruling classes have watched what happened in France. They fear radicalism, they fear disorder, they fear the possibility that revolutionary ideas might cross the channel. Yet by protecting the price of grain, they have chosen to place one of the most politically sensitive objects in history at the center of a national argument. The loaf, once again, it waits quietly on the table. And once again, people begin asking who has made it expensive. Let us move from the crowded streets of Paris to the smoky towns of Britain, where revolution does not arrive in quite the same way. There are no crowds dragging a king from Versailles. There is no Bastille falling beneath a summer sky. Instead, there are factories, chimneys, canals, warehouses, and rows of brick houses darkened by coal smoke. The 19th century is beginning, and Britain is changing with extraordinary speed. In Manchester, machines turn beneath factory roofs. In Birmingham, workshops produce metal goods for a growing market. In London, docks receive ships from distant parts of an expanding commercial world. The countryside is changing too. Fields are enclosed, agricultural methods improve. Old patterns of village life slowly give way to a society in which more people depend upon wages. For these people, the price of food matters enormously. A household that grows much of its own food can suffer terribly from a bad harvest, but it possesses at least some direct connection to the land. A factory worker has a different relationship with hunger. He works. He receives wages. Then he enters the market. If prices rise, his money simply buys less. There is no field behind the factory waiting to feed him. There is only the baker. This makes industrial Britain particularly sensitive to the price of bread. The Corn Law passed in 1815 therefore enters a society already under strain. The wars against Napoleon have ended. That sounds like good news. For years, Britain has spent money, men, ships, and resources fighting France. Now soldiers return, military demand falls, industries that benefited from wartime spending adjust, employment becomes uncertain. And agricultural interests fear that peace will bring cheap foreign grain into the country. British landowners possess enormous political influence. Many members of Parliament come from landed families or are closely connected to agricultural wealth. They argue that British farming needs protection. If foreign wheat floods the market at low prices, domestic grain prices may collapse. Farmers may suffer. Rents may fall. Agricultural communities may face hardship. There is logic in the argument. But the worker in Manchester hears something else. Expensive bread. The law restricts imported grain when domestic prices remain below a certain level. In practice, critics believe this helps keep food prices higher than they otherwise might be. And so a powerful political image forms. The rich landowner profits, the poor worker pays. It is not a perfect description of every economic consequence, but political symbols rarely need perfect precision. They need clarity. A loaf provides that. Imagine a room in an industrial town. It is evening, the light is poor, coal smoke has found its way through cracks and clothing. A worker returns after a long day. Perhaps his hands are stained with oil. Perhaps cotton dust clings to him. Perhaps he has spent hours beside machinery loud enough to make conversation difficult. On the table is bread. There may be potatoes now, unlike in the medieval world we left behind. There may be tea, perhaps a little cheese, perhaps bacon when wages allow it. The diet has changed, the importance of bread has not disappeared. His wife tells him the price has risen, again. There are children to feed, again. His wages have not risen enough, again. Somewhere far away, gentlemen have debated grain imports. Here is what their debate looks like: a thinner supper. This is how political anger travels, not through theory alone, through translation. Parliament speaks the language of tariffs and protection. The household translates it into slices. How many slices for the children? How many for the adults? Can yesterday's loaf be softened in broth? Can flour be stretched? Can something cheaper be bought instead? The questions are ancient, only the factory smoke is new. Opposition to the Corn Laws grows slowly. There is no single morning when Britain wakes and decides the laws must disappear. Different groups oppose them for different reasons. Urban workers resent high food prices. Industrialists dislike policies that seem to favor landowners. Economic thinkers argue that freer trade will make food cheaper and commerce more efficient. Political reformers see the laws as evidence that Parliament serves a narrow, privileged class. Again, bread gathers many grievances around itself. This is what happened in France, though the circumstances are very different. Food becomes a bridge between abstract political structure and daily suffering. A man may not care deeply about theories of parliamentary representation until he believes the structure of Parliament is making his bread expensive. Then representation becomes personal. The years after the Napoleonic Wars are difficult. Economic distress and political agitation grow. Calls for parliamentary reform become louder. The government fears radical movements. Memories of the French Revolution remain close enough to frighten the ruling classes. France has shown what can happen when economic misery and political exclusion meet. British authorities do not wish to repeat the experiment, yet repression can produce its own anger. In August of 1819, a vast crowd gathers at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform. Families attend. Workers arrive dressed in their Sunday clothes. Banners move above the gathering. The atmosphere has elements of a public demonstration and a civic occasion. Then local authorities attempt to arrest the speakers. Mounted men move into the crowd. Chaos follows. People are struck down. Some are killed. Many more are injured. The event becomes known as the Peterloo Massacre, a bitter name echoing the recent British victory at Waterloo. Peterloo is not simply a bread riot. Its central demand is political reform. But economic hardship forms part of the world that brings people to the field. High food prices, low wages, unemployment, the Corn Laws, political exclusion. These pressures overlap. A hungry household does not separate them into tidy chapters. Neither does history. The government responds to radical agitation with further restrictions, but demands for change continue. Eventually, parliamentary reform begins to advance. The Reform Act of 1832 alters representation, removing some notorious inequalities and expanding the electorate among parts of the male middle class. It does not create democracy as modern listeners would understand it. Most working men still cannot vote. Women remain excluded, yet the political landscape shifts, and soon the campaign against the Corn Laws becomes far more organized. In the late 1830s, the Anti-Corn Law League emerges as a major political force. Its strongest base lies among the manufacturing interests of northern England. Manchester becomes one of its great centres. Two names become especially associated with the movement: Richard Cobden, John Bright. They argue that the Corn Laws are economically harmful and morally unjust. Cheap bread becomes one of the movement's most powerful promises. The phrase is simple: cheap bread. It can fit into a speech, onto a poster, into a conversation. And More importantly, everyone understands it. A complicated economic argument has been reduced to something a person can imagine holding in both hands. A loaf. The League is sophisticated. It organizes meetings, it distributes printed material, it raises money, it sends speakers around the country, it works to influence elections and parliament. This is not the spontaneous crowd of the medieval grain market. It is modern political campaigning taking shape. Yet beneath the printing presses and public halls lies the same ancient question. What should bread cost? The campaign also exposes tensions within the opposition. Factory owners support cheap grain, partly because they believe lower food prices will benefit workers and the economy. Workers sometimes suspect another motive. If bread becomes cheaper, will employers simply reduce wages? It is a reasonable fear. The worker knows that generosity is rarely the foundation of industrial capitalism. So even a movement promising cheap bread must persuade the people it claims to help. This makes the politics more complicated than a simple battle between cruel landowners and heroic reformers. Landowners fear genuine agricultural disruption. Industrialists possess their own economic interests. Workers possess theirs. Farmers possess theirs. Merchants possess theirs. The loaf sits among them like a silent witness. Everyone wants to explain what is best for the person who eats it. The person eating it may have doubts about all of them. Still, the campaign grows. Public meetings attract enormous audiences. Speakers describe the Corn Laws as a tax on food. They argue that protection enriches landlords at the expense of consumers. The moral language is deliberate. This is not presented merely as an efficient trade policy. It is presented as justice. Bread should not be made artificially expensive to preserve privilege. The old moral economy has changed clothing again. In medieval England, people expected local authorities to punish dishonest bakers. In revolutionary France, crowds demanded controls against grain speculation. Now British free traders argue almost the opposite policy. They want fewer restrictions on grain imports. Yet all three positions can appeal to the same moral instinct. Ordinary people should be able to obtain bread at a fair price. History has a sense of humor about such things. The same moral goal can produce completely different economic policies. Control the market, free the market, regulate the merchant, remove the tariff. Behind each argument stands someone saying that this will make the loaf fairer. Then nature intervenes. It often does in the history of food. During the middle of the 1840s, harvest difficulties placed new pressure on food supplies. Most disastrously, potato blight strikes Ireland. The potato has become central to the survival of millions of poor Irish people. When the crop fails, catastrophe follows. Fields that should provide food instead hold rotting plants. The smell of decay hangs over places where families depend upon the harvest. This is not simply another season of expensive food. It becomes the Great Famine. Hunger spreads, disease follows, people die. Others leave Ireland in enormous numbers, boarding ships for Britain, North America, and elsewhere. The disaster is shaped not only by plant disease but by poverty, landholding patterns, government policy, relief failures, and the unequal structure of Irish society under British rule. The Corn Laws now become even harder to defend. Britain's Prime Minister is Sir Robert Peel. Peel is a conservative. His political party includes powerful landowning interests that support protection. Yet he becomes convinced that the Corn Laws should be repealed. The Irish crisis adds urgency. This decision tears his party apart. Politics becomes bitter. Old alliances fracture. Men who have worked together turn against one another. And at the center of the argument once again is grain. In 1846, Parliament repeals the Corn Laws, with the restrictions scheduled to disappear through a transitional process. The Anti-Corn Law League has won its great campaign. Peel has achieved repeal. He also pays a political price. His government falls soon afterward. A law designed to protect British agriculture has lasted for roughly 3 decades. Its repeal becomes a landmark in the rise of free trade as a powerful British political idea. But for the tired worker carrying a loaf home through Manchester, the ideological victory may feel less dramatic. He still has work tomorrow, rent is still due, coal still costs money, his children still need shoes. History rarely ends when legislation passes. It simply changes direction. Yet something important has happened. Bread has helped reorganize British politics without producing a revolution like the one in France. The pressure is channeled through associations, speeches, petitions, elections, newspapers, and parliament. The crowd has not stormed Westminster, a king has not been executed, but the political power of food is unmistakable. A grain law has divided parties, mobilized cities, filled meeting halls, produced mountains of pamphlets, and helped bring down a government. The loaf has learned a new method. It does not always need a barricade. Sometimes it needs a campaign, sometimes a petition, sometimes a vote. Sometimes an exhausted politician staring at reports of a failed harvest and realizing that the old policy can no longer survive. Britain continues into the industrial century. Railways spread, steamships cross seas. Grain begins moving across distances medieval bakers could scarcely imagine. Eventually, wheat from vast agricultural regions overseas will help feed European cities. The relationship between the field and the loaf becomes more global. A baker in London may depend upon harvests far beyond Britain. A family in Edinburgh may eat bread made from grain carried across an ocean. The supply chain grows longer. It also becomes more powerful. For a time, this seems to promise escape from the ancient trap of local famine. If one region suffers a poor harvest, grain can arrive from another. Railways move food quickly, steamships make transport cheaper, markets connect continents. Perhaps, finally, bread can become boring. Just bread. Something bought without thinking, something sliced at breakfast, something placed beside soup, something too ordinary to bring governments down. But history is not finished with the loaf. Because the new global food system creates new dependencies. Cities grow larger. Millions of workers no longer produce their own food. Armies become enormous. Modern wars interrupt trade on a scale earlier centuries never experienced. And governments discover that industrial societies require astonishing quantities of grain every single day. A medieval village may fear one failed field. A modern capital fears a railway line stopping, a port closing, a ship sinking, a currency collapsing. Bread has become connected to machines, empires, banks, railways, and war. Its politics will become larger too. Now we move from the smoke-darkened factories of Britain toward colder streets in the east. The 19th century fades. A new century arrives with electric lights, mass newspapers, enormous factories, and armies counted in millions. In Russia, an empire stretches across a vast portion of the earth. Its ruler is an emperor who claims an authority that seems almost ancient. Nicholas II is Tsar of all the Russias. His palaces glitter, his government commands soldiers, his empire possesses immense land and resources. Yet by the winter of 1917, none of that will answer the question being asked in the streets of Petrograd. Where is the bread? Once again, before a revolution begins, people are waiting outside a bakery. We drift onward, deeper into colder lands where winter lies heavily over an empire, and the bread lines seem to grow longer each morning. Petrograd is freezing. The city that had once been called St. Petersburg has changed its name during the Great War, but a new name has done little to make its winters kinder. Wind moves through the broad streets. Snow gathers along walls and beneath bridges. The Neva lies beneath ice. Factory chimneys breathe dark smoke into a pale sky. People hurry through the cold with their collars raised and scarves pulled tightly around their faces. And outside the bakeries, they wait, mostly women. Some have been standing for hours. They stamp their feet against the cold. They rub their hands together. They talk. They complain. They listen. A rumor moves down the line. There will be no bread. Another rumor follows. There is flour somewhere. The railway has failed to bring it. Merchants are hiding it. The government has lost control. Someone says the army has taken too much. Someone else says there's plenty of grain in the countryside. Perhaps all of these claims contain a little truth. Perhaps none explains the whole problem. The women in the queue do not need the whole problem explained. They need bread. It is the winter of 1917, and the Russian Empire is exhausted by war. For nearly 3 years, Russia has been fighting Germany and its allies in the enormous conflict later remembered as the First World War. Millions of Russian men have been mobilized. The army consumes vast quantities of food, clothing, fuel, weapons, horses, and railway capacity. Casualties are terrible. Families receive news from the front. A husband is missing. A son is wounded. A brother is dead. Another letter never arrives. At home, the economy struggles beneath the weight of war. Prices rise. Fuel becomes difficult to obtain. Transport systems strain. The railways must carry soldiers and ammunition toward the front, while somehow carrying food toward the cities. Russia is not necessarily empty of grain. This is one of the bitter ironies. Food exists, but food in a distant field is not the same thing as food on a city table. Grain must be purchased, loaded, moved, unloaded, milled, distributed, baked. Every step can fail. A railway wagon delayed hundreds of miles away may eventually appear as an empty bakery shelf in Petrograd. The city feels the failure, not the distance. Workers feel it especially. Petrograd is a great industrial center. Its factories employ large numbers of men and women who depend upon wages. Like the workers of Manchester a century earlier, they do not simply walk into a family field and harvest supper. They buy it. When prices rise faster than wages, the old arithmetic returns. More money for less bread, longer work for smaller meals, and now there is war on top of everything. Women carry a particularly heavy burden. Many men are away serving in the army. Women work in factories, they care for children, they manage households, they search for food. A worker may finish a shift only to begin another kind of labor in the streets. Find bread, find potatoes, find fuel, wait, always wait. The queue becomes part of daily life. There is something politically dangerous about a queue. People who might never meet otherwise are placed beside one another for hours. They have time to talk. They compare experiences. One woman says her children have eaten almost nothing. Another says she visited 3 shops yesterday. A third says her husband at the front has no proper boots. Someone curses the merchants. Someone curses the government. Someone curses the Tsar. A few years earlier, such words might have been spoken more carefully. Now exhaustion has weakened fear. This is how regimes sometimes begin to disappear, not when everyone suddenly becomes brave. When too many people become too tired to remain afraid. Tsar Nicholas II is far from the bakery line. The Russian monarchy still surrounds itself with ceremony, hierarchy, uniforms, titles, and tradition. Nicholas believes deeply in autocratic rule. To him, the monarchy is not merely a political arrangement that can be casually redesigned. It is a sacred responsibility inherited from his ancestors. But inheritance does not guarantee competence. The empire has already experienced revolution once during his reign. In 1905, after military defeat and domestic unrest, strikes and protests spread across Russia. One of the most infamous moments occurs when peaceful demonstrators march toward the Winter Palace carrying a petition. Troops fire upon them. The event becomes known as Bloody Sunday. The shock damages the old image of the Tsar as a distant father who might protect ordinary people if only he knew their suffering. Nicholas later accepts the creation of a parliament, the Duma, though the struggle over political authority continues. The monarchy survives. But survival can be misleading. A cracked wall may remain standing for years. Then one winter, a small pressure brings it down. By 1917, the cracks are everywhere. Military failure, inflation, food shortages, political frustration, labor unrest, distrust of the imperial court. And the strange, damaging reputation of Grigory Rasputin, the Siberian holy man whose closeness to the imperial family fuels scandal and rumor. Rasputin is murdered in late 1916. His death solves nothing. Winter continues. Bread remains difficult to find. Nicholas spends much of his time at military headquarters away from Petrograd. His wife, Empress Alexandra, is deeply unpopular among many Russians. Her German birth becomes a source of suspicion during a war against Germany. Rumors flourish. The court appears isolated, and isolation is dangerous when people are hungry. The same pattern has returned. Versailles, Petrograd, different palaces, different centuries, different political systems, the same fatal distance. Inside, reports outside, queues inside, officials discussing supply. Outside, a woman counting coins with numb fingers. Inside, confidence that order can be restored. Outside, someone saying that tomorrow there may be no bread at all. Then February arrives, according to the old Russian calendar used at the time. By the calendar familiar to much of Western Europe, it is March. The dates can be confusing, the hunger is not. On International Women's Day, women workers begin demonstrations in Petrograd. Some are textile workers, they leave factories. They enter the streets. They call upon other workers to join them. Their demands include bread. The word is simple enough to shout, bread. Other demands follow, an end to war, an end to autocracy. The crowd grows. Workers from other factories join. Strikes spread. Tens of thousands become hundreds of thousands. The streets fill. Again, history expands with astonishing speed. A woman may leave home intending to find bread. By evening, she is part of a political crisis. The government attempts to restore order. Police confront demonstrators. Troops are called upon. Nicholas receives reports. At first, the regime does not fully understand the danger. Governments rarely do when they have spent too long hearing only themselves. The assumption is familiar. The disturbances will pass. The crowd will tire. The workers will return to the factories. Bread deliveries will improve. Authority will reassert itself. But the crowds do not disappear. More workers strike. Public transportation is disrupted. Demonstrators occupy streets and bridges. Political slogans become more radical. The question now is whether soldiers will fire. This is the moment upon which regimes can depend. A government does not survive merely because people obey laws. It survives because when obedience ends, someone is willing to enforce them. Police, soldiers, officials, if those people refuse, authority can vanish with astonishing speed. At first, troops do fire in some confrontations. People are killed. But then something begins to change. Soldiers mutiny. Some refuse orders. Some turn against their officers. Some join the demonstrators. Weapons pass into the hands of the crowd. The barrier between protest and revolution collapses. And suddenly, the monarchy faces a problem no bread shipment can solve. Its soldiers are no longer reliable. Nicholas attempts to return toward the capital, but events move faster than the imperial train. Politicians form new centers of authority. Workers and soldiers organize soviets, councils that echo institutions created during the earlier revolution. The Duma refuses simply to disappear when ordered. Power begins separating from the throne. Within days, the old regime is collapsing. Think of the speed. For centuries, the Romanov dynasty has ruled Russia. Palaces have been built, wars fought, borders expanded, generations have been born beneath imperial portraits. The monarchy appears woven into the fabric of the country. Then, within a matter of days, the fabric tears. Nicholas abdicates. The imperial throne is gone. The bread lines remain. This is the cruel joke history tells again and again. Removing the ruler is often easier than removing the shortage. A provisional government now attempts to govern Russia. It inherits the war. It inherits economic disorder. It inherits the food crisis. It inherits millions of exhausted people who expect change immediately. But revolution has not created more railway wagons. It has not repaired the transport system overnight. It has not brought dead soldiers home. It has not restored the value of money. It has not filled the bakeries. So Petrograd remains restless. The monarchy has fallen, yet the central question of daily survival has not been answered. Where is the bread? Other political forces are waiting. Among them are the Bolsheviks, a revolutionary socialist party that will soon be associated above all with Vladimir Lenin. Lenin is not in Russia when the February Revolution begins. He returns in the spring. His message is radical and clear. The war must end. Power should pass to the Soviets. Land should go to the peasants. And the revolution must move beyond the liberal provisional government. Peace, land, bread. 3 short promises. Each speaks to a different wound. Peace to soldiers and families exhausted by war, land to peasants who have long resented unequal ownership, bread to workers standing in queues. The political brilliance of the slogan lies partly in its simplicity. It does not ask a hungry person to study a complicated program before understanding what is being offered. Bread is enough. Everyone knows what bread means. Bread means tomorrow. Bread means children eating. Bread means wages having value. Bread means a government that functions. Bread means that the railway has arrived. Bread means the mill is working. Bread means the city has not been abandoned. In the months after the fall of the Tsar, Russia becomes increasingly unstable. The provisional government continues the war. Military offensives fail. Discipline deteriorates. Peasants seize land. Workers become more radical. Political authority fragments. And food remains a source of anger. By autumn, the Bolsheviks are strong enough to make their move. They seize key points in Petrograd. The provisional government is overthrown. Another revolution has taken place within the same year. The consequences will reshape not only Russia, but the world. Civil war follows. The old empire is transformed. A new Soviet state eventually emerges. Millions will experience further hunger, violence, displacement, and political upheaval. Bread does not magically become plentiful because revolutionaries have promised it. No revolution possesses that power, but the promise mattered. It mattered because bread had already become a judgment upon the old order. The Tsar commanded an empire stretching across continents. He had palaces, regiments, titles, churches that prayed for him, officials who bowed, portraits hanging in government buildings. And still his government could not reliably place bread in the shops of its capital. For a monarchy claiming almost unlimited authority, that failure was devastating. Unlimited power invites unlimited blame. The woman standing in the Petrograd bread line may know nothing about constitutional theory. She knows that the Tsar claims to rule. She knows there is no bread. The conclusion is easy to make. This is why the history of revolutions so often returns to food. Hunger simplifies politics. It strips away ceremony. A crown is impressive until the bakery is empty. A uniform is impressive until the soldier wearing it is hungry too. A palace is impressive until the crowd realizes that the people inside it are frightened. And in Petrograd, during that freezing revolutionary winter, the old empire discovers the same truth that rulers have been discovering since grain was first stored behind walls. People can forgive many failures. They find it harder to forgive a government that stands between them and supper. The revolution has won its moment. Bread has not. That distinction follows Russia into the months and years ahead. Petrograd changes hands politically, but an empty shelf remains an empty shelf. The Bolsheviks can issue decrees. They can seize government buildings. They can speak of workers, peasants, land, peace, and a new social order. They cannot command wheat to grow faster. They cannot repair every railway by declaring that history has entered a new age. And they cannot make hunger disappear simply because hunger helped bring them to power. Soon, Russia falls into civil war. The country fragments between competing armies and political movements. Railways become military prizes. Agricultural regions are fought over. Grain procurement becomes increasingly coercive. Cities suffer. People leave Petrograd and Moscow in search of food. Factories slow, trade breaks down. Money loses much of its usefulness in some places. The countryside and the city stare at one another with suspicion. Peasants possess grain. Cities need it. The state demands it. The old argument returns in a harsher form. Who owns the loaf before it becomes a loaf? The farmer who grew the grain, the merchant who would once have transported it, the worker who needs to eat, the army defending the revolution, the government claiming to act for everyone. There is no quiet answer. The Bolshevik government increasingly sends detachments into the countryside to obtain grain. For officials in starving cities, requisition is necessity. For a peasant household, watching grain leave the village, it may look like robbery. Again, perspective changes everything. Again, the loaf sits between competing definitions of justice. This is the same argument we have encountered throughout our journey, though the clothing has changed. In medieval England, the baker stands beside a scale. In France, a crowd forces grain to be sold at what it considers a fair price. In industrial Britain, reformers demand that Parliament stop protecting expensive grain. In revolutionary Russia, a new government attempts to seize and redistribute food through state power. Control the market, free the market, regulate the loaf, protect the farmer, protect the worker, feed the army, feed the city. Every age invents a new answer. The stomach keeps asking the same question. Is there enough? Perhaps this is the moment to return to where we began. Not to Petrograd, not to Paris, not to Manchester, but to that medieval oven. The baker is still there in imagination. His sleeves are pale with flour, his face is warm from the fire. Outside, muddy boots move through a market. Someone lifts a loaf and weighs it in one hand. It feels a little too light. That tiny gesture contains almost everything. The customer does not need to know the chemistry of yeast. She does not need to understand national grain production. She does not need to calculate transport costs. She knows what yesterday's loaf felt like. Memory gives her a standard, and when the standard is broken, she begins asking why. This is how ordinary objects become political. Not because someone declares them political, because people depend upon them. A loaf is intimate, it enters the home, it is touched, cut, shared, counted. A crown may be seen only on special occasions. A law may exist as words most people never read. A tax may be complicated. Bread is obvious. There is either enough or there is not. It is affordable or it is not. It is on the table or the table is empty. And the closer something lies to survival, the more dangerous unfairness feels. That is why food riots across history often display an unexpected sense of order. People do not always behave like a chaotic mob seeking destruction. They may possess rules of their own: do not destroy the grain, sell it. Do not take everything. Measure it. Do not accept the merchant's price. Set a fair one, pay. Then take the food home to authorities. This is disorder. To the crowd, it can feel like the restoration of order. That distinction matters. People rarely describe themselves as villains in their own story. The grain merchant believes he is conducting trade. The landowner believes he is protecting agriculture. The minister believes he is reforming an inefficient market. The revolutionary believes he is defending the people. The peasant believes he is protecting the harvest his family produced. And the mother in the breadline believes her children should eat. History places all of them around the same table. Then it waits to see who controls the knife. There is another reason bread has carried so much political weight. It is repetitive. Hunger returns. A person may be angry about an insult for a day. A person may be angry about a tax when the collector arrives. But food is needed continually. Morning, afternoon, evening, tomorrow. The day after that, a food crisis therefore renews itself. Every meal becomes a reminder. Every bakery queue becomes another political meeting. Every price increase becomes fresh evidence. A government may hope public anger will fade. Then breakfast arrives. The anger is hungry again. This repetition helps explain why women appear so often in the history of food protest. In many societies, women have carried much of the daily responsibility for obtaining and preparing household food. They know prices, they know quantities. They know which baker is honest. They know which merchant has raised his price. They know exactly how much flour remains at home. So when food systems fail, women may encounter the crisis before political leaders fully understand it. The market becomes their source of intelligence. A missing sack of flour is information. A shorter queue at one shop and a longer queue at another is information. A sudden price change is information. The household economy produces its own experts. They do not sit in ministries. They stand in marketplaces with baskets. This is why the women marching toward Versailles are not a strange accident in the story of the French Revolution. Nor are the women workers entering the streets of Petrograd. Food places politics directly into their daily labor. When that labor becomes impossible, protest can become another household task. Find bread, feed the children, confront the authorities. Return home if possible. The extraordinary enters the ordinary without asking permission. And still, we should resist making the story too neat. Bread alone does not cause revolutions. People do not overthrow governments every time wheat prices rise. History is full of terrible famines that produce suffering without revolution. It is full of revolutions that have causes far beyond food. For bread to become revolutionary, other conditions usually matter. A government may already be weak. War may be exhausting the state. Political institutions may have lost legitimacy. Inequality may appear intolerable. New ideas may give people a language for their grievances. Networks may allow crowds to organize. Soldiers may refuse to fire. Elites may be divided. Then hunger enters. Bread becomes the match placed beside material that has been drying for years. France, before its revolution, possesses a monarchy in financial crisis. A deeply unequal social order, political conflict, public criticism, and demands for reform. The expensive loaf does not create all of this. It makes everything harder to ignore. Russia, before the fall of the Tsar, possesses military disaster, political distrust, labor unrest, institutional weakness, and enormous social tensions. The bread queue does not create all of this either. It gathers the tensions in one visible place. This is perhaps the best way to understand food in revolutionary history. Bread is rarely the entire cause. It is often the meeting point. Weather meets economics, economics meets class, class meets government, government meets rumor meets hunger, hunger meets the crowd. And then the crowd starts walking. Sometimes it walks toward a market, sometimes toward a palace, sometimes toward a prison fortress, sometimes toward a government building. The destination changes. The footsteps sound remarkably similar. Imagine them now, not as one crowd, but as many. Mud beneath medieval shoes, rain beneath the feet of women marching to Versailles, factory boots on the streets of Manchester, snow beneath workers in Petrograd. Different centuries seem to overlap. A bell rings in an English market, a drum sounds in Paris. A factory whistle calls through smoke, a Russian soldier lowers his rifle. And somewhere in every scene someone is carrying bread. Perhaps that is why rulers have spent so much effort regulating it. They understand, even when they do not say so openly, that the loaf is a political object. Roman emperors understood the importance of grain supplies long before the medieval English assize. Cities throughout history have created systems to secure food. Governments have subsidized bread, fixed prices, controlled imports, released grain from stores, punished hoarders, protected convoys, built granaries, encouraged farming, restricted exports, removed restrictions. Sometimes these policies work, sometimes they make matters worse, sometimes they work for a while and fail when conditions change. But the effort itself tells us something. No ruler likes a hungry capital. A distant province may suffer quietly for far too long. A hungry capital is different. It contains government offices, palaces, barracks, printing presses, factories, crowds. The people who are angry are physically close to the people they blame. Versailles is close enough to march toward. The Winter Palace is close enough to surround. Distance, in politics as in baking, changes the temperature. There is a quieter side to this history too. Most bread never begins a riot. Most loaves disappear without entering any historical record. A farmer harvests grain, a miller grinds it, a baker wakes in darkness. A child tears a piece from the crust. Someone dips it into broth. Someone saves a portion for later. Someone gives the last piece to an older parent. No chronicler notices. No minister writes a report. No soldier is called. This ordinary bread matters just as much, perhaps more, because peaceful meals are what political systems are ultimately trying to protect, whether they admit it or not. The absence of rebellion is difficult to see in historical records. A town that eats well and goes to sleep leaves fewer dramatic documents than a town that breaks open a granary. So history can sometimes make the past appear like an endless parade of crises. It was not. There were quiet mornings, successful harvests, honest bakers, fair prices, neighbors sharing, markets functioning exactly as expected. Millions upon millions of meals that ended without anyone overthrowing a king. Those forgotten meals are the background against which the revolutionary loaf becomes visible. People know what normal feels like. That is why crisis hurts. A loaf becomes political when it stops behaving normally. It shrinks, its price rises, its quality falls, it disappears. The change is noticed because bread is familiar. Perhaps somewhere in York, centuries ago, a child watched a parent cut a loaf into pieces. Perhaps somewhere in Flanders, another family did the same. In Cornwall, Edinburgh, Canterbury, Normandy, London, Paris, Manchester, and Petrograd, the forms of bread differed, the grains differed, the ovens differed, the laws differed, but the gesture was recognizable: divide the loaf, make sure everyone receives something. There is politics hidden even there. Who gets the largest piece? Who waits? Who sacrifices? Who decides? A household is not a kingdom, of course, but hunger teaches fairness at a very small scale. A child understands surprisingly early when another child has received more. Adults do not lose that instinct merely because the table becomes a market and the parent becomes a government. This may be the deepest reason the moral economy survives through so many different centuries. People accept that scarcity exists. They do not always accept that scarcity should be unfair. When everyone is hungry, suffering may be understood as tragedy. When one group feasts while another starves, tragedy begins to resemble injustice. And injustice demands an explanation. The explanation may be accurate, it may be exaggerated, it may become a rumor, it may become propaganda. But once people believe the system is designed against them, the legitimacy of the system becomes fragile. A king cannot eat enough bread to solve that problem. Neither can a parliament, nor a revolutionary committee. They must somehow make the ordinary system work: fields, transport, markets, mills, ovens, wages, prices. That work is far less dramatic than storming a palace. It is also much more difficult. Revolutions are remembered for moments. Government is judged by mornings. Can people wake up and buy food? Can they heat their homes? Can they work and receive enough in return to live? Can they believe tomorrow will be roughly manageable? These questions sound boring. Perhaps that is appropriate for our journey tonight. Much of history depends upon boring things working correctly. A cart arriving, a mill turning, a scale balancing, a railway running, a clerk recording the correct quantity, a baker waking on time. Civilization often rests not upon grand speeches, but upon thousands of ordinary people doing ordinary jobs without interruption. Only when they stop do we suddenly notice them. The grain cart does not arrive, the mill has no flour. The bakery door stays closed, the queue grows. Someone asks why, someone begins shouting, and somewhere in a palace, an official receives a report that the situation is becoming serious. By then, it may already be too late. So the next time a loaf sits quietly on a table, it may be worth giving it a moment of respect. Not too much. It is still bread, but inside that simple object lies an astonishing chain of human effort. Soil and rain, seed and labor, harvest and storage, transport and trade, milling and fuel, yeast and water, heat and time, law and money, trust, especially trust that the grain has not been hidden. Trust that the scale is honest. Trust that the currency will still buy something tomorrow. Trust that the road is safe. Trust that the government will not allow the entire system to collapse. A loaf is the final product of all that trust. When people tear bread apart at the table, they are holding the successful end of a very long social agreement. When that agreement fails, they notice quickly. The medieval authorities understood part of this when they regulated the weight of bread. The French monarchy understood it when grain riots frightened officials. British campaigners understood it when they turned cheap bread into a political cause. The Russian revolutionaries understood it when they placed bread inside one of the most memorable promises of their age. Different solutions, the same loaf. And now the streets grow quiet again. The crowds fade. The banners are folded. The soldiers disappear into snow and memory. Versailles becomes a museum of monarchy. The old factories of industrial Britain change or vanish. Petrograd becomes Leningrad and, much later, St. Petersburg again. The medieval baker's name, if anyone ever wrote it down, is probably forgotten. But his oven remains easy to imagine. There is something timeless about fire glowing against stone. The dough rests, the baker waits. Outside, dawn approaches. Soon the town will wake. Boots will cross the mud. Doors will open. Coins will be counted. Someone will carry the first warm loaf home beneath a woolen cloak. Steam may rise when the crust is broken. For one morning at least, there is enough. No riot, no march, no revolution, just breakfast. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside this long history. Bread becomes revolutionary only because peaceful bread matters so much. The great drama begins with the desire for something profoundly undramatic: to work, to return home, to sit near a small fire, to divide a loaf, to feed the people you love. and to believe that when morning comes, you will be able to do it again. Kings have underestimated that desire. Ministers have misunderstood it. Merchants have sometimes exploited it. Revolutionaries have promised to satisfy it. But generation after generation, ordinary people have continued asking for essentially the same thing. Enough. Not necessarily luxury, not a palace, not a banquet beneath chandeliers. Enough bread, enough warmth, enough certainty to sleep without fearing the morning. And when a society can no longer provide even that, the quietest object on the table can begin to speak very loudly. The oven fire settles, the last embers glow red. Outside, somewhere beyond the old stone walls, fields lie dark beneath the night. Wheat moves softly in the imagination, though no wind can be heard from here. Tomorrow it will be harvested, then milled, then baked, then divided. Most likely, nothing remarkable will happen. And after everything we have seen tonight, perhaps that is the most comforting ending history can offer. A loaf reaches the table, everyone eats, and nobody starts a revolution.